So I like to introduce the next speaker, Pathik. Funnily enough, also from UC Irvine. It's a place where things happen, I guess. And Pathik is a professor of psychiatry and human behavior, obstetrics, and a lot of more things. Mostly biology, I guess. And his presentation will be on conditioning and perspective for development and evolutionary science. So, have fun.
Thank you. So here's an outline of what I hope to go through in the next hour or so. A very brief synopsis because it bears repeating in terms of what we understand Krishnaji to have said on this process of freedom from the known. Then I'll introduce a question, which is, how is it that we've come to acquire our specific mental and physical characteristics? And this is of interest to me for lots of reasons, not the least of which that this is actually the topic of my research program. And in that context of acquiring our specific characteristics, I'll bring up the phenomenon or the process of conditioning and talk about the role of conditioning at the individual level, at the population or species level, and then speculate about the role of conditioning, perhaps even in the origin of life itself. I'll talk about the process of conditioning in this context, which relates to energy capture, storage, and utilization, and then put up some more questions. So, all in all, there'll probably be far more questions than answers here. And just want to repeat, because it bears repeating, something that Don said earlier. We often regard science as a body of knowledge, but it's really not in the formal sense a body of knowledge. It's an approach to inquiry. And then that inquiry might happen to produce knowledge, but it's a certain approach. And 2 or 3 of the key characteristics of the scientific approach are, again, that the fact of the matter or actuality or truth cannot ever be proven. The proposition that something is not true can either be disproven, which is not the same as proving it. Something is not true can either be disproven or it can not yet have been disproven. So there is, I would submit, a lot of tentativeness in this approach. There are no assertions that this is how it is. This is not how it's not, or we don't yet know that. And it doesn't necessarily rely on observation and measurement. In fact, many of newer scientific ideas can't be operationalized in terms of observation and measurement, in part because tools don't exist. That doesn't make the enterprise non-scientific. And there's a principle called the principle of scientific parsimony, and in a sense, that's something that Don said, that to try to work with the least number of variables or the least number of assumptions. And if you can explain something with 2 assumptions, then that's always a quote-unquote superior explanation to explaining the same phenomenon with 3 or 4 assumptions. So just to quickly repeat what our superstar already told us about yesterday. That's my new term for you. So Krishnamurti's central concern, as we know, was quote-unquote to set man absolutely, unconditionally free. And we know that the known, which is a repository of knowledge about the past and the responses to the past, tends to influence responses to the present. This process is also referred to as conditioning. And freedom is that state or process in which responses to the present are not necessarily influenced by the past. And Krishnaji emphasized freedom specifically in the domain of the quote-unquote psychological states or responses. the key reason why he brought this up was that he suggested this is the quote-unquote root cause of all conflict and suffering, this constant desire for the movement from what is to what should be. And he suggested that the engagement of a certain quality of attention or observation or perception, not of the content, but of the process, the operation of this process of conditioning, could in and of itself bring about a cessation of this activity. So then again, to repeat, conditioning is the phenomenon whereby responses to events or circumstances are influenced by prior information. It's as simple as that, as opposed to prior information or memory or knowledge not having a role. And this is one of my favorite quotes that starts getting into this question. So many of you have probably seen this in some form or the other. No man steps in the same river twice. Again, no man steps in the same river twice, for it's not the same river. Things change. But then there's one more piece to it. And he's not the same man. So another way of saying this is that life is a series of conditional probabilities, and I'll try to go through this quickly and simply. If something happens to me today, I'm exposed to something or I experience something, then my response to that occurrence or that exposure is a joint function of two things. One are the characteristics of the exposure, what that specific exposure, its nature, magnitude, duration, things like that. And then also my individual response to that exposure, because if many of us are exposed to the same exposure, there might be a lot of variation from person to person in how we respond. So the response to an exposure is a joint function of some characteristics of the exposure and the individual's response. Now the individual's response to that exposure, turns out, is again a joint function of the enduring or the lasting effects of yesterday's exposure and the response to yesterday's exposure for that individual. And then the effects of the determinants of the response to yesterday's exposure is in turn the enduring effect of day before yesterday's exposure and the response to that. So you see, it goes back and back and back and back. And so the question is, well, the question's on the next slide. The effects of past conditions modify the effects of the present, which then logically would also be expected to modify the effects of future exposures. And the question is, when and where did this process start? Did this start when one is an adult, is a child, right at the time of birth? Is it even prior to birth, at the time of conception? Is it even prior to conception, prior to that individual even coming into being, about her or his parents, their parents, how many generations back, going all the way to species, phyla, the last common ancestor, perhaps even the origin of life itself, and we're going to look at this a little bit. When and where did this whole process of life, being a series of conditional probabilities where responses are conditioned upon the enduring effects of prior responses and exposures, when did this start, and what purpose might this serve? Is this one of these, in Krishnaji's words, wrong turns, or is there some purpose to it, or is there a place for it, and then other places where it might not have a place? So of course Krishnaji asked the question, is it possible for the mind, for the brain or the mind to be totally free from conditioning? And he emphasized total as opposed to partial. As we said, he emphasized psychological as opposed to what he called biological or physical. And he made two assertions with respect to this question. One is, yes, he said it is possible. And two, he asserted that this possibility exists for every individual or within every individual. So these are, if I understand right, the two assertions he made in response to this question. And so now here's a list of questions that I hope to walk us through with respect to the phenomenon of conditioning. What is the origin of this phenomenon at the level of the individual, at the level of the population, which is a group of individuals, the species, and then some speculations, as I mentioned, about the origin of life itself. What is the origin of the phenomenon of psychological conditioning? And here I'm going to be brief and really address the question, or try to address the question of, is the origin of psychological conditioning a specific aspect of the more general phenomenon, or is there something different about it? And then the third question I hope to address, again fairly briefly, because I'm going to spend a lot of time on this first part, is if one says that there exists a possibility for everybody, what are the implications of that, the for everybody part? And these are some corollaries that I'm not going to discuss in too much detail, but I will touch upon some of them. What's the origin of the sense of self as opposed to another self? Perhaps what's the origin of self-centered activity, of conflict, of cooperation? And then this might look a bit weird, but what's the origin of the brain itself? When did brains come into the picture? So this sort of sets the stage, if you will, for some of what I want to discuss. Questions like, what's the fundamental nature of the universe? Is it disorder or is it order at its root, at its most fundamental? I'll be talking about what I mean by those terms. Is the emergence of life a purposeful or a non-purposeful phenomenon? In other words, can the emergence of what we call life be understood without evoking a higher or deeper purpose or goal? The next question is, once life comes about, is the journey of life, which is characterized by the differentiation of life over time from very simple organisms to complex organisms with many different cell types and organs and tissues and so on, is that journey certainly looks like it's a creative process. And I'm using the term creative in the sense that there's novelty that's being produced. New things that didn't exist yesterday are coming into being. So in that sense, the journey of life over time is a creative process. But does it need a creator? Can there be a process that's absolutely creative, but doesn't need a creator? Obviously, the features of life involve a lot of design features in what different cells and tissues and organs do. But does this design need a designer? Is the acquisition of complex neural structures and functions, such as the very creation and expansion of the brain and its abilities, is it a determinant or a consequence of changes in external conditions such as climate, culture, and technology? Many of us are used to thinking about brains doing things, and then the things that brains do produce changes in the external world. And I'm asking the question, is it really a producer of changes in the external world, or is a brain the result of variation in external conditions? Or is it both? And if so, is there? And then can the origin, attributes, and consequences of possessing a sense of self be understood as an emergent phenomenon? I won't go too much into that, but maybe. So, starting with the question of what's the origin of the phenomenon of conditioning. So this happens to be something, I don't use these words in my academic work, but this is exactly the question that I've been looking at for several years now. I've established and I direct a program at the University of California, Irvine, which is the study of the nature and consequences of the interplay between biological, behavioral, psychological, and social processes in fetal, neonatal, and infant life, and the effects of this interplay on subsequent health and disease risk related outcomes. And we're a decent sized group, and we're spread across many different universities. So before getting to the question of fetal life and development, I thought we'd start here to try and make a point. So obviously the general function of any automobile is to be able to transport someone from point A to B. That's something that, but if one were to show you this picture and say which is the best car among these three, you might quickly say, well, it depends, and it depends on for what purpose. Because if speed is the purpose, then one of those three would be the best. But if safety is the purpose, maybe another one. And if carrying a heavy load is the purpose, maybe yet another one. So but that's only part of the answer, for what purpose. The other part of the answer, which is not as apparent or not as readily apparent to most people, is that it's a combination of for what purpose and under what kind of conditions will it be used. So if speed is still my priority, that's how I want to judge these. But if the terrain that I'm going to drive the car is very hilly, rocky terrain, no paved, smooth roads, then probably this car would go the fastest, because these two would get stuck. Even though on good roads, this one might. So purpose, the idea is that there is no across the board qualifier for purpose. Purpose also depends on context or local conditions in which that thing is operating. That's the simple point I want to make here. So obviously then when one thinks about building a car, one reverse engineers it and decides what the purpose is of this automobile over and above the ability to take me from point A to B. Under what kind of conditions am I going to use it? So you determine that first. Then you develop a blueprint of how to put it together. Then someone does the work of putting it together. And obviously, being a non-living entity, the thing has no role in its own construction. Who ever heard of a car building itself? Maybe cars can navigate themselves these days, but we haven't heard of one that de novo builds itself. But for living entities, it's the exact opposite for all three. It so happens that living entities play a very active role in their own development. They participate in their development. There isn't a blueprint in the sense that there is for a machine. There are some rough specifications, and maybe I'll get into that a little bit, but there isn't the kind of blueprint that there is for non-living things. And some degree of functioning right from the get-go has to start, because this little bit of functioning then is a critical stimulus for the next stage of building of structure and function. And so it's a sequential back and forth process. So it would make sense to you if I said something like how well a car is built is a critical determinant of its structural and functional integrity and the likelihood that it's going to break down over the course of time. Right? I mean, it's not a difficult sentence to agree with. And so what could purpose be, if I could use that word, in the context of living organisms, and what might be the most important conditions one has to take into account? Because as I said, for what's the best car, it depends on the purpose and under what conditions. So if we say what's the best built organism that one could build, whether it's a human or a cat or whatever, what's the purpose and what are the conditions? So at its most simple, for all life form, I want to suggest that the purpose, the most fundamental purpose, I cannot think of a purpose more fundamental than the one I'm going to share with you, is that of energy capture, storage and utilization. Because anything must have energy in order to subsist, and nothing, either mechanical or living, can de novo synthesize energy. All the energy that's available on this planet comes in the form of photons from the sun. And there have to be methods of capturing, storing, and using some of that. And there is no function more fundamental than that for a living entity. So I'm going to suggest that that is the ultimate purpose that design is going to be considering. And conditions then are therefore logically going to be variations in energy substrate availability. So how much is locally available, in what forms is it, what's the stability of supply, is it stable or is it sporadic, is it unpredictable? Those are the conditions that are going to be considerations. So then one could say how well an individual is built is a critical determinant of her or his state of health and propensity for developing diseases over the course of her or his lifespan. And here I'm going to focus on two words, built. What do I mean by built? It was pretty obvious in the example of a car, but what does it mean to build or develop an individual? And what does the word well mean here in this context? And so I'm going to suggest the definition of built simply is phenotypic specification, so the features, so how, what's the acuity of my vision, how well does my liver work, how does my heart work in response to variations in oxygen and this and that. It's, so, you know, not every heart is a heart is a heart. There's variation in structural and functional integrity, and that's what we call, the word for it in biology is phenotype and phenotypic specification. And then well is again a relative term. There's no absolute well, but well is optimization of phenotype to the context or to local conditions. If somebody is going to survive with a certain amount of food because there's a food scarcity, then the mechanisms that hang on to every unit of calorie and store it rather than just expend it and burn it are optimal in that context. But that same mechanism of not wasting any calorie, storing every possible bit of calorie in conditions of adequate food would probably make the individual, would predispose her or him to obesity and metabolic dysfunction. So the same property is not across the board going to be optimal. It might be optimal in a particular context, but it might actually be suboptimal in a different context. So that's what I mean here by the word well. And I won't spend any time on this, but this just happens to be a list of diseases in adult life and early life that confer the major global burden of disease. So if you had a magic wand and were told to fix 5 health problems so that there would be a benefit to the population as a whole, these are the ones you'd pick. All of these are what are called complex common disorders, and the idea here is that the risk or the probability of any individual over the course of her or his life developing a complex common disorder is a joint function again simply of two things: exposure to risk factors for that particular disorder and predisposition in terms of the response to exposure to those risk factors. So I'll go through those two terms in quickly. So for example, caloric excess might be a risk factor for obesity, cholesterol for atherosclerosis, and insulin resistance for diabetes, and negative life events for depression, the risk factors. So people exposed to these risk factors are at risk for developing these kind of disorders, very simple. But we know that a group of people exposed to the same amount of risk exhibit considerable variation in terms of the expression of disease. And that's what one means by predisposition. So predisposition is technically individual differences in the effects of one unit of a risk factor on expression of disease. So for each unit of excess calorie, I might have a predisposition to very quickly become obese, which I happen to have, and somebody else might be able to tolerate a lot of excess without necessarily becoming obese. So the question is, the exposure to risk factors part is simple, and that's what medicine focuses on, do this and avoid that. The question of predisposition is not as well understood, but the traditional paradigm, and it's still the prevailing paradigm, although it's changing slowly, is that predisposition or propensity or susceptibility is entirely contained in one's genetic makeup, the DNA-based pair sequence. And that now is being questioned by the paradigm that many of us are proposing, the developmental programming paradigm. And according to this, we're saying, no, there's one step between genetic makeup and expression of disease, and that is the integrity of the developmental process. So we're saying predisposition is, which we define as integrity of structure and efficiency of function, is a function of genes and early environment, where the emphasis is on early, not just any environment, but the environment during development. So then development is a journey from potential or genotype to specificity of structure and function, phenotype. And the requisites for development are an environment, as I said a little while back. The critical part from the environment is energy and certain other signals that I might talk about. And information, critically, which is what the genotype is. It's just a reservoir of information. So those two things are the requisites for development, and then there are these interactions between genes and environment. So the concept of phenotypic plasticity, this is a bit technical, but I'll try to make it simple, and hopefully you'll appreciate in a few minutes why I'm bringing up some of these issues. This does have something to do with conditioning. So the ability for of environmental conditions during development is simply called phenotypic plasticity. These are phenotypes. Plasticity is adaptability or malleability. You take some seeds from a plant. They're all genetically identical. They're from the same plant. You plant some of those seeds 10 feet away from the parent plant. You take some to 6,000 feet altitude. You take some to sea level. You take some to places where there's a lot of water in the soil, others. And if a new plant does grow, you'll see quite a bit of variation in the structure of these plants from the same genes as a function of the conditions during development. That's phenotypic plasticity. And developmental programming is the process by which the developing embryo or fetus does three things. It actively looks for, or it seeks, then it second acquires, and third uses information about the conditions in the environment during development, and it uses this information to actually build itself or to produce variation in how it builds itself. So you're not going to get, as a result of environmental variation, some people with 4 eyes instead of 2, or 3 ears instead of 2, or 6 limbs. No, those are constraints that are in the heritable germline or DNA, but you're going to get quite a bit of variation based on variation in the environment in the properties of different cells, tissues, and organ systems, all the way from the brain to every different differentiated cell type. And so then these changes, it's not an on-off switch, but then these changes interact with the environment and produce more changes, and it's a back and forth process. So this is called developmental programming. And so in this context, energy plays 2 roles. One, you need energy to grow and develop. But the second role energy plays, and that's the more critical role in programming, is you look for signals about energy. So it's not so much that you're using the energy, that you do here, but you look for signals about how much energy is available to me, in what form, what's the stability of supply, or what kind of time scale, and that is absolutely critical aspects of the development of the brain and the rest of the body. So again, to summarize, variation in developmental conditions produces variation in the developing organism's phenotypes, completely independent of the genotype, which then has implications for health and disease risk related processes. And there are a bunch of questions we ask that I don't think I'll go into too much. So I'll make a couple of points moving on. So we all start from, as you know, one cell, the zygote or the fertilized egg. All of us and every living thing, whether it's a unicellular organism, it stays as one cell, or whether it's multicellular, like we are, starts from one cell. And then the first cell division produces 2. The next cell division produces 4. The third cell division produces 8. The fourth cell division produces 16. And would you know it, by the time somebody is born, the average human has 6 trillion cells. I bet some of you don't even know how much a trillion is. We know how much a million is, but it's a million. Or is it 1,000 million? Even I forget. It's a rather large number. And that happens with just 45 cell divisions. That's the power of exponential numbers. And then from the time of birth till adulthood, there are only 10 more cell divisions. So that gives you at least some idea of the pace of development in just the first 9 months or 40 weeks of life, from conception till the time of birth. And one question I like asking is, at what age is the mortality rate the highest? So let me explain this question. If one takes a population of humans on this planet or in this country or in this town, and let's say we divide them by age, everybody who's 100 plus, and the second group that's between the age of 90 and 100 years, the third group that's between the age of 80 and 90, and so on. And if one asks the question, this thing's falling off, at what age, intuitively one might think, well, the oldest age, the proportion of people who will die, let's say in the next year, who are already 100 plus, is higher than the proportion who will die, who are 80 to 90, is higher than the proportion who will die who are 50 to 60. And turns out that's wrong. The highest mortality rate is in the first 6 to 8 weeks after conception. And that mortality rate is 65 to 70%. Less than a quarter, or maybe a quarter or a third at the most, of people who ever come into existence make it till the time of birth in humans. And I'm going to hopefully tell you why a little bit later when I start talking of the production of variation in the context of evolution. So it's, remind me if I don't, because otherwise it would be weird just telling you this and then leaving it hanging. There are certain questions here in terms of how this process works, what's the direction of causality, what's the hierarchy of developmental effects. I'm not going to have too much time to go into these, but one of the questions is, remember I told you that energy plays 2 roles. One is it actually is needed for the purpose of growing and developing. The second role energy plays in development is that it provides signals or cues about how much is available. And so is there a monitoring of the actual state of energy, or is there a reliance on cues or proxies or markers of energy? And what happens if the cue is different from the actual state? I'm going to show you a couple of studies that will make a point with respect to whether development cares more about the actuality of the condition or a cue or a marker, even if it's inaccurate. And in terms of the direction of causality, I'm not going to have time to talk much about this, but many of us are used to thinking of fetal development and the maternal compartment as a caring place, and sharing things with the child that's developing, be it in utero or after life. After birth. Turns out that the entire process is characterized by an acute sense of conflict between the two compartments, and each one trying to pull in its own direction, and then a certain resultant state that occurs, and I'm going to get into perhaps why in a bit. So this is the question that we specifically ask. I'm going to fly you through 10 slides now because I'm not going to spend time discussing what we actually do, but just to give you some sense, we study humans, we enroll women during pregnancy, we follow them through birth, and then we follow their children over time. We study lots of different prenatal conditions and lots of biological systems, genes, epigenetics. We have very, very detailed protocols. Our women who are volunteers spend hours and hours and hours with us undergoing assessments, and then they also do things at home and over the course of multiple days. We've developed technologies where we put sensors on them so that we can monitor them 24 hours a day for lots and lots of different physiological parameters. We study things like not only conditions and states during pregnancy, but in some of our studies we enroll women who've had adverse experiences early in their own life. We study in one of our projects women who in childhood were exposed to sexual or physical abuse, and we ask the question of, is this affecting not just the woman, but the development of a child when she becomes pregnant? We study processes like migration and immigration and what impact this has not just on the person, but on offspring that they're carrying. There are certain reasons why these are important questions. We study biology, including hormones, immune processes, genes, stem cells, genetic markers of aging, mitochondria. These are the places in cells that use glucose and oxygen to make ATP, or it's the form of energy that drives life. So these are sort of the factories of energy production. We study oocyte biology. This is one thing that some of us know, but it's kind of interesting to realize that when a woman's pregnant with a female, a girl, every single child that girl is ever going to have in her life later, the girl who's right now in utero, all the eggs are already formed in the first weeks after conception. There are no new eggs or oocytes that a female mammal produces after early gestation. So something that influences not only the mother, but the girl she's carrying has the potential to influence every single child, male or female, that this girl will ever mother in the entire course of her life. So there's sort of 3 generations at stake. With males carrying a male child, you have the stem cells that are going to make sperm, so there can be effects for the 3rd generation, but the actual sperm are produced later. They're not made in the male in utero. We study the brain of the fetus. We've published studies that show that under certain conditions, babies are brighter and solve problems under certain conditions better than under other conditions. We study a phenomenon called premature birth, being born too early or too small. We study details of the structure and function of brains of babies right from birth onwards with different kinds of MRI. We study details of body composition with things like DEXA and other measures of metabolism. We don't stop at birth, but we study subsequent conditions. One of the conditions that interests us a lot is breastfeeding and the composition of breast milk. We've published a whole bunch of studies. I mean, we've got about at least 250 publications now on different aspects of this topic. That essentially suggests that conditions in intrauterine life affect risk for heart disease, for psychosomatic disorders, for respiratory disorders, allergies, for memory, and even aging. This is our newest hypothesis, that by definition, age-related disorders happen in old age, but the trajectory of the rate of aging is determined in intrauterine life, as early as that. And we've published quite a bit. A little bit of this work is now becoming, entering the sort of popular, sort of mainstream media, but most of it is still, I'd say, in early stages. So I've discussed why, which environmental conditions and how, but the crux of this is that there's an interplay between environment and a priori information, and the process of building a living organism critically relies on the consolidation and impact of accumulation of information about conditions. And I hope you're beginning to see that this is, again, the definition of conditioning. In other words, the deployment of information about the past in informing responses to present conditions. It absolutely is congruent with the crux of the definition of conditioning. And so I'm suggesting to you that there couldn't be development if there wasn't this phenomenon of conditioning happening at this level. I have one example of cues because Don told us a few interesting things about, when one sees something or hears something or feels something, it may not matter whether it is so or not, whether it's real or not. What matters is whether it's useful or not. And so development uses a lot of cues. This is one of my favorite studies. So happens that I don't think I'll describe it to you, but if you ask me a question, I will later. But I'll just leave you with the finding of the study that when developing organisms are looking for information about the environment, and if a cue they use is discrepant with the actual condition, and you can do this experimentally in animal models, then development follows the cue and not the actual condition, even when you expose them to the actual condition. So you're not hiding it from them. For example, if there's a cue in the environment that there isn't enough food, but you're giving them food, more than enough food, so they're actually eating. It's not a question of what they believe, but the cue, in this case, tape recordings of squirrels that live in high density conditions, which suggests there's little food, then all the parameters of development follow the cue that there isn't food, even though they're eating it and there's plenty. And you can flip it around. When you look in the Galapagos at these birds called blue-footed boobies because they have blue feet, they're a very unusual bird in that after each mating, most females produce 2 eggs, and the unusual thing is that they lay these 2 eggs 1 week apart on average. So same genetic material, same male, female, both eggs fertilized from her eggs with the same father. After the first egg is laid, people actually have gone and painted the feet a different color blue, because blue is a marker in these animals of certain aspects of health of the male. You understand what I'm saying? They just changed the color of the feet by actually taking a brush and changing, and it completely changes the characteristics of the second offspring that's still gestating for a week with nothing else. So there's some puzzle looks, but I'll go over that slowly later. So we've talked about the phenomenon of conditioning very superficially, but at least I hope it gives you a bit of a flavor at the level of the individual. Now I'll switch to at the level of the population and species. And for this, we have to take a step back and actually consider the question of what is life before we can discuss what I was hoping to discuss with you. Most of us assume we know what life is, and the fact is that most of us don't precisely know what that is. We all have a sense of it as, such and such characteristics different. The most precise definition that's currently used in biology only came about in 1992. It's a bit of a mouthful. Life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of undergoing Darwinian evolution. So life is described not by biology, but chemistry. There's no need for bringing in the word biology in describing life. And to unpack this a bit, self-sustaining simply means a chemical reaction that's autocatalytic. So the two chemicals that are reacting, one of them also has the additional role of a catalyst. So it can keep the reaction going. Capable of Darwinian evolution is that there must be some element of copying or replication in this chemical system. And the key part is that that replication or that copying cannot be accurate. There has to be error in the thing that is copied from the parent. Because if it was faithful, it wouldn't be capable of evolution, because there must be the production of variation. And so when you have a system, a chemistry, that simply satisfies these two conditions, an autocatalytic reaction, where there's some replication of something, and the replication has some errors in it from the parent thing, that it was replicated for. We then have used the word life for this. This is what life is. There's nothing else that's in it at its most basic, fundamental. All life has a common origin. I'm not going to go over that. And so now I'm going to bring up this business of conditioning. But for this, as Don told us what his assumptions were, and he listed 2 or 3 assumptions that were starting points. So for this formulation, the assumption is the universe as we know it in the context of the most fundamental laws that govern the universe, the second and the first law of thermodynamics. And so these are the only assumptions that are made in the formulation I'm about to share with you. So as we've discussed, the most fundamental requirement of life from its environment is energy. Because to keep something in a, to let it have structural integrity, the second law says it's going to fall apart, entropy. The most fundamental nature of the universe is disorder, not order. Things dissipate, fall apart, break down. So to prevent something from breaking down, if it's going to maintain itself, it needs to withstand the force of entropy. To do that, it has to do work, literally. And to do work, it needs energy. It cannot synthesize energy, so it has to go look for capture and use some energy from the outside. So now the question is, how much energy does it need? And you might initially think, well, to stay the way it is, it needs exactly the same amount of energy as is required to do the work of withstanding entropy, but that's not so. It always has to capture more than it needs. And the reason it has to capture more, again, comes from the second law, which is that you cannot use all the energy that you have. Some of it has to be lost to heat. So if I have to do 10 units of work, and if each unit needs 1 unit of energy, then I have to have more than 10 units of energy that I capture. If I only capture 10, I'm not going to be able to do the work I need to do. So there always has to be more that's captured than is needed to get the job done at the end of the day. So the autocatalytic reaction that is capturing energy will then contain in it the drive to always achieve more efficient energy capture solutions. This is not a new design that's put into the system. By definition of it being autocatalytic replicant system, it has to have this. There's no choice in the matter. It's not somebody decided that this is a good strategy. It couldn't be otherwise. And the drive will be perpetual. See the beauty of it. With just 2 or 3 conditions, you set up something that perpetuates forever and becomes more and more complex. And it's perpetual because, again, the second law says that you can never reach an efficiency of 1. So because you cannot reach an efficiency where I can use all that I've captured, that attempt to improve on in terms of the efficiency cannot stop. And then this sets up the drive for what people assume is a fundamental property of life, which is to go on living. That's an epiphenomenon. The property comes from the laws of thermodynamics and the chemistry, not because somebody decides, hey, it would be nice to endow life with this property of perpetuating itself. And therefore, evolution is not about survival and about reproductive fitness. Those are things that come quite a bit down the road. But it comes from this very simple, extremely simple chemistry, and from these laws, particularly the second law. So now, if there is a search for more efficiency of energy capture solutions, if I build something that's a little more efficient than the machinery YAP has, it's not that it comes for free, it comes at a cost, because I have to build something more complicated, right? If I'm building 5 units in my machinery, he's working with 3, then the building of those 2 units and the maintaining of those comes at a cost, which is an energetic cost. It takes more energy to build more structure and have more function. So then this is where the business of weighing the costs and benefits happens. So if the solution in terms of the gain in efficiency is more than what it costs to build it in terms of the energy needed, then it's a feature that has a likelihood of persisting. And if it's a feature where it costs more to build something than the gain in energy at the end of the day, then it's going to get lost. It's not going to persist. And so there's competition going on here in terms of these different solutions. Constant competition and conflict. It's not survival of the fittest, that's silly. In terms of someone eating you, this is where the competition is. This is what's driving the system. So now switching to the environment, the one constant feature about environment, we all know this, but this is absolutely true, is that environment is never stable, it varies. Usually varies because of things that happen to this planet from outer space. That's the biggest source of variation in conditions on this planet. And there's a dimension of predictability, so certain things happen predictably. What is the most predictable thing on this planet? What is the most? You would bet your last cent on it if you had to put a bet. It has to do with the rotation of the Earth around its axis. There will be a night and there will be a day. I mean, there's virtually nothing that is more certain than that. Yeah, that's not 100% certain, but that's close to 100%, right? And so there are a whole bunch of changes that happen that are rhythmic, periodic, highly predictable. There's certain things that are very unpredictable. So the monitoring of energy capture solutions, which always has to be, as I said, in local contexts, in the context where the organism is and where it's doing the monitoring, looks very critically at predictability. This is what drives, the adaptive significance of prediction machines. And where when things are so predictable, then you don't build phenotypic plasticity. But when things are not so predictable, when local conditions vary from those conditions on the coast to those 100 miles south, then you try to have phenotypes that local information plays a bigger role in building. Am I you following the logic of it? So then conditioning is more important for certain things than other things by this logic. And then the most critical requisite for this process to operate is information or memory about degrees of quote-unquote success about prior attempts, the cost-gain ratio in particular contexts. Is it, I'm walking you through this very fast, but is it sort of okay? So now let me superimpose a few things that I think are interesting. life always needs to capture more energy than is required to do the work of sustaining life. And I'm wondering whether the drive to always try to collect more than what's actually needed, if this is the most fundamental basis for it. There are many other things that go into this, but if this is where it at the end of the day comes from, because it can't be reduced any further, and this is a necessity. If the dissatisfaction with the way one is, the business of becoming and of not being satisfied, I wonder if this is where it is, this inherent drive to always try to capture. And then the sad news is that by this formulation it can never be fulfilled. So not only is it perpetual, but it will always be the case. By this formulation could not be an ending to this, or the ending is death or extinction. And then I've already briefly mentioned competition as opposed to cooperation, and I'll talk later about where cooperation comes in. I've talked a little bit about prediction, the movement between past, present, and future, and you understand in this context the importance, the absolute critical importance of prediction as opposed to, just being content with what is and conditions that are. And then, of course, the role of memory and conditioning in consolidating this information, whether it's in the base pair sequence, in DNA, epigenetic things, brain culture, these are all different media of basically information storage. And not just passive storage, but then that being deployed. So, so the, absolutely cool thing about the theory of evolution, at least biological evolution, and I agree with Dan that it probably extends to much beyond or earlier than biological evolution, is, and again, no time to walk you through the specifics, but there's a sort of dance or an interplay between a process that's random and then selection that's not random, but that's context specific. And so then this process seamlessly, effortlessly, easily is creative because it produces novel things all the time, but it's not conscious. It produces new design, but without a designer. I mean, it's so audacious at the surface of it that, Dawkins has a nice analogy. He says if you're going for a hike here and you see a rock, you're not going to give it a second thought as to how did this rock come to be exactly the way it is. It's like whatever. It's a piece that broke from something and the wind and so on. But you find, an exquisite Swiss watch, a mechanical one. Who could ever believe that it just came about through a thing that didn't involve design, that didn't involve creation, and life, and what it has is how many thousandfold more elegant than any Swiss watch. And it's extraordinary. I mean, it's so easy to talk of this, but it's so extraordinary to, and so anyway, for this presentation, the point is the absolutely essential role of the process of conditioning, the consolidation of information and the use of that at each step. I'm not going to obviously go through this business of the origin of life and whether conditioning played a role here. I'm going to suggest that it does, because even before the first living cells, the laws that govern the chemistry that had to be present for these autocatalytic reactions follows exactly the same principles. So it is very unlikely that evolution is a descriptor of that is restricted to living things. It almost certainly predates life, the same principles, and we can some other time walk through this and the first steps of cells and the origin. the self, one of the interesting things is that probably recognizing who is not part of me came first before the boundary of who I am had to come about. And this has to do with the immune system and the development of the immune system, much before there were brains. So one of the points I want to make here is there any additional ingredient that's contained in life that's not present in what one would say non-living matter? So is it that this is non-living matter, this is living matter, so there's this part of it which is unique to life that you can't find in non-living matter? Or is it this, which is that everything that is contained in what we call life is also contained in the larger universe of matter? So life is just a subset, a specific of the larger set of matter, and this almost certainly is the fact of the matter, not this. There is absolutely nothing that one has found. And just to share with you, literally 2 weeks ago, 10th April 2019, this paper was published in Science. This was not the only, but one of the reports where these folks synthesized a bit of DNA. They didn't take it out of something living, they actually synthesized it, and they selected which genes to code for and built a certain matrix around it, all of this from non-living stuff, and they could produce organisms that sure looked like they're alive. So these things had metabolism, they could capture energy, use it, they could replicate for up to 2 cycles, they could move. They built 2 of these to compete with one another in terms of getting to a food source earlier, and so then they could start seeing in the replicates which features, whether this is following evolution or not. All of this completely starting 100% from inanimate matter. Nothing introduced into it. And this is one of like tons of work like this, but I show you this because it's literally 2 weeks old, and it had made a big splash in the media. They were very cautious in not calling this life, but they kept using the word life-like in this paper, and I think that's mostly for political reasons, but it certainly meets the criteria of life as defined by the 1992 definition. So now briefly, the phenomenon of psychological conditioning. For this, one has to appreciate something to do with reverse causality. If I say I have an organ that does such and such function, and it does it by using such and such molecule, it turns out that the very development of that organ, the evolution of that organ, these things had to exist in some prior form, and they're the ones that built the organ. So what the organ does is actually, it comes about through those same things or some precursor, some ancestor of them constructing that organ, and I'll give you a couple of concrete examples. So as we know, the pancreas makes insulin, and insulin is an important hormone in regulating blood glucose. But the very evolution of the pancreas depends on a pro-insulin form that was doing glucose homeostasis before a pancreas existed, not doing it very well. And then the pancreas was a conditioning or a consolidation of all of this to do this better. But it's not that this function wasn't happening till there was a pancreas. It is exactly the same with a brain. There's absolutely nothing, not one thing that brains do that wasn't being done and isn't being done by organisms that don't have brains. And it turns out that if a brain, let's say a brain is required for the experience of or the generation of emotion, and let's say dopamine is one of the neurotransmitters that's involved in particular emotions, then there was dopamine much before there were brains, and that dopamine was, in this case, producing positive motivation for certain actions much before there were brains, and had a role in building a brain evolutionarily. So today you need the brain for this, But how the brain came about is from this. It might sound odd to you, but that's what you call reverse causality in biology, and that's the case for every differentiated structure. So there's a hierarchy, not a separateness, but a hierarchy where genetics comes out of evolution. So all of genetics contains evolution, but not the other way around. Physiology comes out of genetics, the brain from physiology, psychology from the brain, and so on, but not the other way around. I have several slides of the evolution of the brain, and I'm not going to walk you through them. Let me try to see if I can put this down in 3 or 4 sentences. The basic idea is that communication within parts of a cell or between cells, from one cell to two cells, was taking place for a long time before there were brains. Still goes on through chemistry and through electrical conduction. There were nerves with neurotransmitters much before there were brains, and then the first brains developed in worms near mouth and eyes, which gives you a hint of the importance of feeding and seeing in terms of processing those signals. Brains were evolved and lost several times. Movements, fear, reward, and pain were the first things to enter brains before any so-called higher or cognitive functions, which again gives you some clues about the hierarchy. Brain expansions or different features of brain are not an antecedent to, but a consequence of conditions in the environment, always. Such as tool use, walking on 2 feet, the discovery of fire and cooking, and the ability to make sound or speech. These are always the antecedents. So one of the interesting things that you were discussing, Don, was, whether we might have new senses, and Krishnji often said, well, what will happen to the brain when there's more and more technology and computers get smart and they do the things we do, and is the only thing that we'll be involved in doing either entertainment or sport, or just fall apart in terms of the brain. Turns out that it is an obligate condition for a next step of evolution of the brain for it to do what it does more efficiently. And so these gadgets, like for example, if, as Don was telling us, a huge portion of the brains today concerned with the simple, it's not simple, but the process of creating vision, visual perception. And if that could be taken over by a little chip, which it can now, and I'm happy to share some articles with you, then we could carry that chip in our pocket or implant it in here, and then you would have a huge amount of brain space, good architecture, good raw material that's available for other things. You could increase the bandwidth of your senses by having sensors that sense different parts of the light spectrum that we can't see through the eyes, or hear sound that we can't hear to the ears, send it to the brain with electrical signals, because that's how all senses get into the brain. You have to remember that the brain does not experience anything directly. There's nothing in us that experiences directly. Everything gets converted into electrical signals, and then it gets constructed or reconstructed in the brain. There is no direct anything. It's not light going into the brain. Light just stops at the retina. Sound stops at the ear. But I'm getting a bit carried away. But it's the same principles here. Environmental changes produce have the potential to produce big changes. Okay. So the last point, which is the psyche and the soma, it it of course was a historical concept that there was something in the spirit, something that couldn't be measured, something in the psyche that's not part of the soma, but that's been discounted for a long time now. There is nothing that one calls psychological that's not part of biology, but not the other way around. There's absolutely no essential distinction between physical and psychological. I can give you lots of examples of things that are encoded concurrently and retrieved concurrently. I can show you with studies in psychoneuroimmunology the connections between these, and also show you studies in terms of pain where there is no difference in the brain or in perception between whether the source of the pain was physical or whether it was psychological, as in me being rejected by somebody and saying, you know, we don't want to have anything to do with you. There's even an evolutionary explanation for the search for truth. A lot of people say that humans have always had this quest for big questions, like the search for truth. And the bottom line is, it turns out that the explanation for the search for truth has nothing to do with the truth per se, or the fact of the matter of something, but it's to establish confidence in the patterns of causes and consequences that we think we see. And here truth represents a high degree of confidence in this correlation structure. And there's a whole neurobiology underlying that. So even that has been corrupted by biologists. You can't have a claim to that being a special quality of humans, you know, this ancient search for the truth. And the last point is the implications of anything for every individual. And again, everybody can't be any one thing. So because the movement of life is through the production of variation, if everybody was the same, including something that we might desire, such as being healthy, who among us would not want a good, potent, optimally functioning immune system? Because you have two ends of the immune system. One end, it's so weak that bacteria that are in the air might be lethal for that person who possesses an immune system that is very weak. And at the other end of the spectrum, you have immune systems that are so hyperreactive that they actually attack the body and produce autoimmune diseases like lupus and MS and all kinds of things. You wouldn't want those. You wouldn't want your children to have those. You'd want everybody to have an immune system that's in the middle, that's not too weak, but not so powerful that it attacks itself. But if everybody were to have that kind of immune system, that would be the case of death in evolutionary terms, because then it is those two ends that have the highest likelihood of being something that is effective in meeting a new infectious antigen, one that doesn't exist. One that exists today, we're already optimized to deal with that, and that's the immune system in the middle. But by getting rid of those two ends, so the price to be paid, so evolution does not work at the individual level, it always works at the population level. So some people dying of normal pathogens or dying because the immune system attacks themselves is a price to be paid by those unfortunate people, so that the population has the best likelihood of dealing with infections that are new, that aren't present today. So there is no trait that everybody could be, regardless of whether it's good or bad. I don't know if I'm making sense. I'm sort of going fast over that. So anyway, I've kind of touched on all of these things, the origin of the phenomenon of conditioning, said a little bit about psychological conditioning, and a little bit about this stuff I tried to weave in terms of self-centered activity, conflict, cooperation I didn't get to talk about, but it's real simple, and it comes from optimizing pull and conflict. Yep, so I think I'll stop there. Obviously they're going to shoot me.